And welcome to One Hero a Day, where everyday courage lives on. Like and subscribe to hear a new story each night. The mornings in Aleppo no longer carried birdsong. They echoed instead with the hush of wind through walls that were no longer whole. A place where buildings once rose now crouched in silence, their ribs exposed to the sky. And in the broken heart of that city stood Al-Kindi Hospital, roofless, ghost-lit by morning ash, and still, somehow, alive. Inside, a man walked the quiet halls. His coat, long faded from white to gray, trailed behind him. His name was Dr. Ammar al-Hassan. He had stayed when others could not. He stayed when he could no longer count how many mornings had begun like this, with silence, dust, and the weight of memory. He had once been offered a seat on the last convoy out. It was winter. The power had gone for good. Fuel was worth more than gold. But he had looked at the ward filled with infants, machines flickering on dying batteries, and felt something tighten in his chest. "I cannot go," he had said. "They cannot go." "So neither will I." He remembered saying it gently, without drama. No one argued. They just nodded, as if understanding that some decisions don't belong to the moment, but to something older, planted in the soul long ago. Now, as the sun filtered weakly through a shattered window pane, he moved down the corridor with practiced steps. The air was cold. He passed a row of metal cots, some empty, some not. He paused beside one. A newborn lay beneath a blue thermal wrap, her breath barely rising. A flickering heater made soft clicks beside her crib. He leaned close, placing his stethoscope over the infant's chest. Steady, slow, still fighting. He closed his eyes for a moment, not in prayer, not quite. Just a pause, a breath shared between one heart and another. This hospital, this ruin of a place, had once been filled with laughter and screams, the chaotic chorus of life being made. Now it hummed with quieter sounds, beeps, shuffles, the sigh of sterilized breath. But for Dr. Ammar, it still lived. It still had work to do. His fingers brushed against a cracked wall where years earlier, his father's name had been etched by a colleague during a night shift. The elder Dr. al-Hassan had stood here too, healing others during the last siege. He had died in these very halls. Ammar had never found his father's body, just his ring, tucked inside a folded gauze in the medicine cabinet. That was all. But what remains, he believed, is not always what's visible. Today would bring more choices. He could feel it in the cold, in the way the generator had skipped twice before humming to life, in the way his hands had trembled, just briefly, when lighting the morning flame beneath the formula bottle. But for now, the girl in the blue wrap breathed. That was enough. He reached for a thermometer, then paused. There at the far end of the hallway lay the sunlight, angled just so, resting across the marble floor like a blanket. It spilled through a hole left by mortar fire. Dust danced in the beam like ash glitter. A single feather floated down from a hole in the roof. He watched it land gently beside the empty cot of a baby who had not made it. He didn't cry. He hadn't in years. But his eyes softened. There was no one else in this ward now. No nurses, no techs. Not even the midwife who used to sing. Just him, the babies, and whatever courage had stitched itself quietly into his bones. Outside, the city groaned with the weight of another day. Inside, Ammar placed the thermometer beneath the girl's arm and whispered her name, the one he had given her when she arrived, wrapped in smoke and silence. "Lena," he said, "you are still here." And as the device beeped, he smiled. A soft sound, like a new breath in the stillness, a beginning waiting in the ash. There had been a moment just after the bombing when silence hung like a held breath. Dust billowed through every hallway, and the ceiling over Ward B groaned before sagging inward. Rubble spilled into the corridor like a slow-moving tide. Ammar had thrown himself over an incubator as debris rained down. The world had narrowed to that tiny plastic shell and the life within it. The power went out instantly. The whir of machines stopped. The hum of the ventilators flattened. The hospital fell into a terrifying quiet. But it was not deathly quiet. There was still the sound of crying, not loud, not wailing, but thin, insistent. One cry, threading its way through the dust and stone, the voice of a newborn, too new to know fear, but loud enough to defy it. Ammar had followed that cry with trembling legs. His flashlight beam shook in his hand. Every breath he took tasted of plaster and smoke. But he moved, stepping over shattered monitors, ignoring the gash on his forehead. He moved because he heard her. He found her wrapped in a singed blanket on the floor, near what had once been a bassinet. Her skin was pale blue at the edges. Her limbs barely moved, but she cried, and that was enough. With trembling fingers, he cut the umbilical cord clean and short and lifted her to his chest. There was no warmth in the room, no light but his flashlight, no sterilization, no order, no protocol, just instinct. He pressed her tiny body against his chest, rubbed her back, and whispered to her in Arabic, soft words, nonsense words. The kinds of things fathers say when they need a miracle and don't have time to ask properly. And then, a breath. A long, shuddering breath that inflated her ribs and settled her body against his collarbone. He felt her grow heavier, more real, more here. He didn't even realize he was crying until a tear slipped from his chin onto her cheek. Afterward, he wrapped her in the cleanest cloth he could find and placed her into the only intact warming cradle. It had been knocked sideways, its heating coil half crushed. He used a candle to warm a bowl of water, tested it against his skin, then dipped gauze in it and wiped her clean. She was so small, no heavier than a loaf of bread. Her fingers barely wrapped around the tip of his glove. He had saved lives before, hundreds maybe, but never like this. Never when everything else had fallen away. In the hours that followed, the air inside the hospital turned cold. Ammar used strips of old uniforms to insulate the windows. He tore apart broken chairs to make a fire in a metal basin. He didn't sleep. He barely sat. He just kept returning to the crib. She didn't cry again for a long time, but her chest kept rising. And somehow, that felt louder than any sound in the world. On the third day, he named her. He couldn't keep calling her the baby, not after everything. Names meant you saw them. Names meant you remembered. He called her Lena. It had been his mother's name. A name he hadn't spoken aloud in years. A name he had almost forgotten how to say without pain. He whispered it into her swaddle like a prayer. Lena, you live. Outside, the shelling had moved to the western ridge. He could see the smoke curling far in the distance through a jagged hole in the hospital wall. Aleppo was quieter for now. It was the kind of quiet that could trick you into hope. Ammar used that window of silence to fix the portable oxygen unit. It had toppled during the strike and cracked at the base. He wrapped its valve with surgical tape and tested the flow with a palm held to the nozzle. There was no gauge left. He had to guess. A dangerous game. But Lena's breaths had become more shallow. She needed help, so he gave her what help he had. There was no celebration, no applause. But something shifted in him when the first puff of oxygen made her chest rise more fully. His hands steadied, his breath slowed. He wasn't just surviving here. He was healing, protecting, delivering, and that meant something. Later that night, he sat on the cracked tile floor near her crib, his back against the wall. The stars flickered above him through a hole in the roof, and he thought of how strange it was to look up at stars while guarding a baby from darkness. Somewhere in that stillness, he found himself speaking to Lena again. You were born when it fell, but that doesn't mean you are broken. He didn't know if she heard, but it didn't matter. He just needed to say it. Around him, the ruined hospital stood like an empty cathedral, hallowed, scorched, silent. But in that small space between her heartbeat and his, something sacred held on. She had been born amid collapse, and still, she breathed. The stethoscope didn't look like much anymore. The tubing was cracked near the base, patched with rubber strips from a bicycle tire. The earpieces had been replaced twice. Yet still, Ammar slipped it over his shoulders each morning like a sacred ritual. He never left his quarters, the storage room he now slept in, without it. It had belonged to his father. Dr. Jamal al-Hassan had worn this very stethoscope during the siege of Hama, decades earlier. Ammar remembered it hanging from a nail by the door of his childhood kitchen, next to a row of battered mugs. His father would come home after 36-hour shifts, smelling of iodine and smoke, and he'd reach for that stethoscope before even removing his coat, listening to Ammar's heartbeat like it was the only thing anchoring him to life. You are strong, he used to say. Your heart knows how to fight. Now Ammar said those same words to the babies, not because they were true, but because he needed them to be. When he'd returned to Al-Kindi Hospital after the last major bombing, he'd gone straight to the third-floor closet, the emergency cabinet where his father used to hide supplies. The cabinet had collapsed, dust and broken glass everywhere. But there, tucked inside a cracked metal lunch tin, was the stethoscope. Old, scorched at the edges, still whole. He hadn't wept then, but he had sat on the floor for hours, turning it over in his hands. It felt like his father had left him a last instruction, not in words, but in presence. A way of saying, go on, I'm still here. Even now, when he pressed the chest piece to an infant's ribs, it was more than a diagnostic act. It was listening through layers, the lungs, the heartbeat, the silence beneath, and beyond all that, to the part of him that still needed his father to be proud. Some nights he spoke to him, not out loud, just quiet thoughts, shared in the liminal space between exhaustion and sleep. You stayed. I stayed too. I understand now. The memory of his father's last days at the hospital still hovered like smoke. Jamal had refused evacuation during the first siege. He'd said the same thing Ammar would say years later. We don't leave the living behind. He had been killed during an overnight airstrike. They never found his body. Ammar was in Damascus when it happened, still a medical resident. He had tried to come back immediately, but the roads were closed. He'd made it 2 weeks later, and by then, the hospital was rubble. But now it stood again, barely, and he was standing in it, holding the same stethoscope. Lena stirred. He rose from his cot and stepped into the ward. She was whimpering, not quite a cry, more a breath broken by dreams. He leaned over her, his fingers gentle on her tiny chest. Her heartbeat was slow, but steady. The tubing on her oxygen supply hissed softly. He adjusted it, then held the stethoscope to her side again. Ba-dum, Badum, Badum. Not strong, not weak, just here. He turned, sat on the nearby stool, and listened a while longer. The sound of life had become his lullaby. In the dim light, he glanced at the others. There were 5 newborns now, 3 premature, 2 full-term, all orphaned, all found within the last 10 days, left by doorways, carried in under gunfire, or pulled from collapsed buildings. Each had a name now. He had given them names from the Quran, from literature, from memory. It wasn't about religion. It was about honoring their stories, making sure that if they made it, they would be someone. His father had believed names were a kind of medicine. He remembered that lesson now, with a clarity sharpened by hunger and dust. The silence outside deepened. Shells had fallen earlier in the day, but night had brought a lull. He dared to light a candle, shielding the flame behind a cracked monitor screen. Shadows danced along the far wall, and he traced the silhouette of the stethoscope in the soft light. His hands were blistered from working with raw metal and tubing. His skin was cracked from the cold. But when he touched the chest piece, his hands stilled. He was not a soldier, not a revolutionary, but this was his resistance. To keep listening, to keep holding on to each fragile pulse. The hallway creaked. A breeze moved through broken glass. Somewhere far off, a dog barked. Or perhaps it was something else. But in this room, there was only the rhythm of breathing, the slow drift of candlelight, the echo of his father's voice beneath the silence. Ammar reached for the cloth hanging from a nail and wrapped it over Lena's cradle. She had begun to calm again. He whispered into the dark, "We stay. We listen. We carry them all." And he lowered the stethoscope, the weight of it resting once more over his heart, just where his father used to wear it. The mornings were marked not by alarm clocks or sunlight, but by the sound of metal, the grinding turn of the backup generator, coaxed into motion by Ammar's hand. He had learned the rhythm of it now, the way the crank had to be turned 3 times slow, once fast, and then again with a firm push before it caught. On good days, it groaned to life by the 7th try. Today, it took 10. Each time it started, he whispered the same words under his breath. "Thank you. Just one more day." The power it gave barely lasted 2 hours, but in those hours, Ammar could charge the incubators, sterilize water, and run the old neonatal warmer, the one patched with copper wire and a prayer. He rationed the usage like a miser with his last coin. The fuel had been scavenged weeks ago from an abandoned ambulance. Hidden behind an old elevator shaft on the 3rd floor, it sat in repurposed water jugs, each labeled with a symbol he made up just for himself. Dots and slashes, reminders of which jug was used, which one contaminated. No one else came that high in the building anymore. It wasn't just the instability, though the stairwells were cracked and the roof above had shifted dangerously. It was memory. That floor had once been pediatrics. Now it held only shadows. Ammar still walked it sometimes, alone. His boots echoing over broken tile, past walls where cartoon murals had once danced. A lion with a stethoscope, a rabbit with a bandage. The paint was faded now, smoke charred, but he remembered every stroke because he had painted them himself back when he first joined the staff. He'd been 28, still laughing then, still whole. He paused near a mural of a smiling sun, the plaster cracked through its center like a wound. This was where they had lost Mariam, the little girl with bone cancer. She used to sit in the hall for hours, drawing her own versions of the murals in her sketchbook. She'd given him one once, a lion that looked more like a potato, with stick legs and bright eyes. He still had it, folded in a plastic sleeve, tucked in his coat pocket. He didn't know why he carried it, only that he had to. Back downstairs, the warmer beeped once, twice, its low battery signal warning of the end. Ammar moved quickly, replacing the battery with a newly charged one. The transition wasn't perfect. There was a flicker, a dip in warmth. But Lena didn't stir. She was stronger today, her color better, her skin less cool. He allowed himself a breath of relief. Next, he moved to the second crib. Amal, the twin who had survived. Her sister hadn't. She had been born under rubble, her head cradled in her mother's broken arm. Amal had come into the hospital with her eyes sealed shut, her fingers curled like dried leaves. Now, days later, she was beginning to stretch, her tiny arms unfurling in the warm air like a child daring to reach for life. He adjusted her swaddle, checking her IV line. Still steady, no swelling, no fever, a win. One of 100 small wins he counted each day. He had learned to collect them like a farmer collects seeds, carefully, reverently. Outside, a low rumble, not shelling this time, just thunder. The skies had shifted. Rain was coming. He walked to the far corridor and placed buckets beneath the known leaks. Rainwater could be boiled and filtered. It was cleaner than the last tap. The city's plumbing had failed months ago. What remained came in rusted bursts from corroded pipes. He rinsed his hands with what little sanitizer he had left, then wiped down the incubator trays. Everything was routine now, a ritual of motion. Not for show, not out of habit, but because doing things the right way, even in ruins, mattered. It preserved something human in the practice. It reminded him that this was still a hospital, that these were still patients, that he was still a doctor. The world might forget, but he would not. Sometimes, during moments like these, he imagined someone watching, not for recognition, but just so that the story would live somewhere beyond his own bones. Someone who would remember that in the middle of a war, one man still measured doses with trembling precision, still logged vitals with pencil and paper, still sang under his breath while boiling formula over open flame. Someone who would remember the names, because names carried stories, and stories carried weight. That was how people stayed alive, not just in breath, but in memory. He had started writing them down. The babies. In a notebook he kept in a plastic bag beneath his cot. Name, weight, condition, date found, date stabilized. A final column left blank, discharge. None had reached it yet. Still, he wrote it every time like a promise. Today, he paused above Amal's crib and glanced out the window. The rain had begun to fall. Soft at first, then harder. It tapped against the jagged edges of the shattered window pane, a rhythm like old songs his mother used to hum while cooking lentils. He closed his eyes, just for a moment. In that sound, there was something that felt like mercy. Not peace, not yet, but a gentler kind of defiance. And as the rain fell over the ruins, Ammar whispered the next name aloud, already knowing there would be another tomorrow to write it down. The smell of antiseptic had long since faded from the halls of Al-Kindi Hospital. In its place was the dust of concrete, the bitter tang of burned plastic, and something faintly metallic, like rusted steel left in a winter field. But Ammar still walked the corridors each morning as if they were whole. His steps slow, measured. His eyes scanning the broken floor, the half-lit walls, the places where life used to move freely. He had been here for 12 years, before the war, before the sieges, before the children stopped laughing in the recovery ward. Back then, he was the young doctor with the tired eyes and the jokes too dry for the nurses. He knew everyone's name, even the janitors. He used to sneak extra fruit into the children's meals. He had dreams of starting a pediatric unit that reached beyond the city limits, mobile clinics that could move into remote villages. And now he was alone. Not entirely. There were still voices on the radio, static-laced messages from 2 other field medics who hadn't left the region. They checked in once every 3 days, coded and brief. Ammar recognized their tones more than their names. But no one else had stayed in the hospital, not after the last shelling that took out the ambulance bay and most of the western wing. Evacuation orders had been issued. He had ignored them. The final call came in person. A convoy from the remaining humanitarian corridor had arrived at the outer gate one dawn. 6 soldiers and 1 foreign coordinator, German, maybe Swedish, a kind woman with kind eyes, who had looked at the babies and then back at him. "You can bring one," she had whispered. "Only one. And yourself." He had shaken his head without hesitation. "How do I choose?" he had replied, and his voice had cracked in the cold. She hadn't pressed him, just nodded and left him a bottle of multivitamins and a handwritten note folded into quarters. It was still tucked under the bricks near the supply closet. He hadn't opened it. He didn't want to read a goodbye. Every day since then had been a decision. Stay. Stay again. Stay still. Some mornings, he stood on the roof with the sun barely rising, watching the distant smoke trails curling from other parts of Aleppo. His mind would drift to Istanbul, where his sister had fled, to Amman, where a former colleague ran a clinic and had offered him a job months ago, to 100 lives he could have chosen. And then he'd hear the smallest whimper rise from the wards below, and he'd go back down. He was never confused about why he stayed. It was not guilt, not ego, not stubbornness. It was belief. Belief that one life saved mattered more than 100 well wishes, that every heartbeat counted, that if he left, the silence would never lift from these rooms again. So he chose to keep listening. The hospital's supply shelves had long been bare. What remained, he made last. Gauze soaked and reused, syringes sterilized over a flame, formula mixed with rice water when milk ran low. He rationed everything, except love. The babies got that in full, unmeasured doses, in the way he cupped their heads, in the lullabies he hummed from memory, in the way he stitched their tiny socks from his own old shirts, cutting and sewing by candlelight. He had learned to hold them not just with arms, but with presence. To be the warmth they no longer had, the protection they no longer understood they needed. When he fed them, it was slowly, carefully, with soft whispers in between. He told them stories they'd never remember, of mountains and apricot trees, of rivers with names that rolled like songs, of lullabies his mother once sang on long summer nights. He wanted them to know, even if only in their bones, that the world was once beautiful and could be again. One evening, as he fed Lena her 3rd full bottle, he realized she had started reaching. Her fingers, once limp and curling inward, now extended weakly toward the light above. Her eyes tracked movement. She was still small, fragile, but she was no longer dying. She was becoming. Ammar sat back in the flickering light of the room, the bottle held empty in his hand, and a slow breath escaped his lips. He didn't smile, but he let his chest loosen for the first time in days. Progress like that. You didn't celebrate it. You guarded it, like a candle in wind. The other babies would follow. He believed that. He had to. Tomorrow he would try the solar panel again, the one he salvaged from a bombed-out school. Maybe enough to power the warmer for 2 more hours. Maybe not. But he would try, because this was his vow. Not just to stay, but to do everything he could, with everything he had left, until the world returned, or until it didn't. In the early hours, when the city seemed to hold its breath, Ammar often sat at the edge of the eastern corridor, facing the shattered window that overlooked what used to be the main road. Dust rose gently with the wind, casting the debris in a soft haze that blurred the broken into something nearly beautiful. That corridor had once been the neonatal wing's observation hallway. Parents used to stand there, peering through thick glass into the nursery, smiling at pink bundles sleeping under warm lights. Now the glass was gone. The wall cracked. The only warmth came from the sun when it dared to rise clear through the smoke. Ammar came here not to remember, but to prepare. He had fashioned a watch point from crates and an old bench. From here, he could see the makeshift path aid convoys sometimes used. He hadn't seen a truck in nearly 3 weeks, but he still checked. Twice a day. Dawn and dusk. Hope wasn't a feeling anymore. It was a behavior. Something he did with his body even when his heart doubted. A low sound stirred behind him. Amal, hungry again. He moved with practiced quiet down the hall, past broken doorways and tilted light fixtures, into the warmth of the room where 5 tiny lives breathed. He spoke to her softly as he approached, his voice low and musical. "You're impatient this morning, Habibti," he said. Her limbs flailed gently, not distressed, just alive. He scooped her into the crook of his arm and held her there a moment, pressing her to his chest. He could feel the rhythm of her heart, quick and urgent. He fed her from a syringe this time. Slow drops, carefully spaced. Her eyes didn't open, but her mouth moved with determination. He watched her, as he always did, with a reverence he didn't show for anything else. He'd once believed he would be a researcher, a man in a lab coat lecturing in cities abroad, his name printed below published studies. He had dreamed of studying neonatal development under stress conditions, trauma, and infant cognition. And now here he was, in the middle of his own unending study, a control group of none, a subject base of miracles. He documented what he could, logged feeding intervals, recorded weight changes using an old kitchen scale he'd recalibrated with coins, jotted notes on skin tone, muscle tone, vocal patterns. There was no university, no journal, no data servers. But the human brain is an archive, and he knew that if these babies survived, every moment he recorded mattered. Amal finished her feed and nuzzled deeper into his coat. He tucked her back in gently and moved on to the others. Little Samir, whose right foot still curled inward, he would need therapy, if not surgery, someday. Layla, born underweight but resilient. Noura, who had a cough he didn't like, shallow and dry. He felt her chest again, still moving fine. But he made a note. Watch for signs of infection. He pulled the thermal blanket tighter around her. Then he lit a small candle, not for heat, but to warm his hands before checking IV lines. His gloves were long gone, torn beyond repair. He had learned to make do with thick cloth and antiseptic washes. He burned his fingers sometimes, but less now. His hands had hardened. That morning, while checking the saline tubes, he noticed one was low. He walked back to the storeroom, a former broom closet, and retrieved a new bag. As he hung it, he paused, feeling the air shift. Something outside. He listened. Not shelling, not jets. Footsteps? He grabbed the wooden rod he kept behind the medicine tray. Not much, but heavy and familiar. He moved to the stairwell, descending silently to the ground floor. There, framed in what was once the main entrance, stood a boy, no more than 13. Thin, pale, one eye swollen shut. He held a bundle in his arms. Ammar stepped forward cautiously. The boy didn't speak. He just raised the bundle slightly, not as an offering, but as a plea. Ammar saw the face of an infant peeking through folds of cloth. He closed the distance in 3 strides, lowering his voice to a whisper. "It's okay. Give her to me." The boy hesitated, then gently passed her over. She was ice cold, not crying, but breathing. Ammar glanced up to speak, to ask where he had come from, but the boy had already turned and fled, disappearing into the rubble as swiftly as he had appeared. He stood there, the new child in his arms, feeling the shock of her weight. Just over 2 kilos, dressed in mismatched rags. No note, no name. He pressed his ear to her chest, still beating, still here. He carried her upstairs, warming her with the crook of his neck, whispering the same words he whispered to all of them. "I see you. I hear you. You are not forgotten." He wrapped her in his extra shirt, swaddled her in a fleece scrap. When the others had settled, he sat beside her and picked a name. Yasmin. For the bushes that used to bloom outside the hospital gate in spring. For the scent his mother wore when she held him during storms. Yasmin. He added her name to the logbook beneath the others. No date of birth. Just brought in by child. Estimated 2 days old. He drew a shaky line, and beside condition, he wrote, unknown. Holding on. And below that, without hesitation, will survive. The nights held a different kind of weight. In daylight, there was the work, the tending, the fixing, the tasks that moved Ammar from crib to scale to burner to corridor and back again. But when night came, especially the windless ones, it was silence that settled over the hospital. A silence so deep, it magnified every sound. The flick of candlelight, the soft rasp of a baby's breath, the creak of settling walls. It was in these hours that memory crept in. Ammar sat near the cribs, wrapped in his wool coat, holding Yasmin against his chest. The others were asleep. Layla whimpered once, then stilled. Amal stirred and rolled onto her side. He kept his hand on the warmer's dial. It held steady. For now. His gaze drifted toward the dark window. Moonlight pooled faintly on the floor. In the quiet, he remembered Rana. She had been a nurse here, bright-eyed, quick-witted. She had always kept extra sweets in her locker, tiny wrapped candies she handed out to crying children and sleepless doctors. Ammar had once teased her that her coat held more sugar than medicine. They'd laughed about it over tea on slow nights, sharing stories of their childhoods. Hers in Homs, his in Damascus. She was the one who had brought in Amal and her twin. She had carried them in a torn blanket, dust in her hair, blood on her arm. "I found them," she'd said breathlessly, "in the stairwell of the Eastern Bloc. I think the mother..." She hadn't finished that sentence. She had handed over the babies, and in the next hour, helped Ammar stabilize them. She'd refused rest, washing instruments, boiling gauze, holding the IV line steady as he inserted it into Amal's fragile vein. At dawn, she went to check on the makeshift water tank near the courtyard. She never returned. They found her scarf hours later, snagged on a rebar hook. The mortar had landed silently, without warning. Ammar had buried her beside the hospital garden, where the jasmine no longer bloomed. He didn't speak her name often, but he felt her constantly, in the way the supply closet was still organized. Her method, not his. In the gentle way he cupped the babies' heads, the way she'd taught him. In the lullabies, he sometimes whispered, half-remembered, hers, not his. Grief had become woven into the routine, a quiet twin to every motion. He looked down at Yasmin. Her chest rose and fell, shallow but steady. He rubbed her back gently, encouraging warmth. Tomorrow he would need to scavenge again. The formula was almost gone, and the IV lines were fraying. There was an abandoned clinic 4 blocks east. Risky, but possible if he timed it before sunrise. He had made these runs before, moving through alleyways, keeping low, listening for drones, always returning before the sun reached its apex. He would leave at first light, but now the only thing that mattered was the weight in his arms, the child whose heart beat like a whispered promise. Outside, the wind picked up. Loose metal clanged in the distance. Somewhere, a dog barked once, then went silent. He reached for his notebook, opened to the page marked with Amal's name. Beneath it, he added a note. Yasmin fed 8 milliliters. Breathing irregular, but audible. Temp improving. His pen paused above the blank column again. Discharge. He didn't cross it out, didn't mark it off. He just circled it lightly, as he had done with the others. Not yet, but someday. He lay back against the wall, cradling Yasmin, and allowed his eyes to close. Not sleep, he couldn't afford that, but a moment of stillness. In that stillness, he imagined the hospital alive again. Lights humming, voices calling out orders, the distant thump of running feet in hallways, babies crying, nurses laughing, Rana handing out sweets. It wasn't nostalgia, it was architecture. He was rebuilding it piece by piece in his mind, so that when the war ended, if it ever did, he would know exactly how to restore it. He wouldn't start with the bricks. He would start with the names, and from them, everything would rise. The sun hadn't yet cleared the distant rooftops when Ammar slipped into the alley behind the hospital. His breath fogged in the morning chill. In his hands, he carried an empty satchel, lined with 2 layers of cloth to reduce noise. Each step was practiced. He knew which tiles were cracked, which metal scraps gave a telltale clink underfoot. This wasn't the first time he'd made a supply run, but it never got easier. The city was quiet, the kind of quiet that rang in your ears. He moved quickly between broken walls and half-buried cars, past the old pharmacy where weeds now grew through shattered tiles, toward the clinic that had once belonged to Dr. Halim, a man known for never turning away a patient, no matter their ability to pay. Ammar reached the back entrance. The door, still charred from an old explosion, creaked open with the nudge of his shoulder. Inside, shadows clung to the corners. Dust floated in the angled light like ash caught in amber. He didn't linger. The place had been picked through before, boxes upturned, shelves looted, but not everything useful was obvious. He moved to the examination room first, checked under the cabinet for forgotten syringes, found 2, still sealed, a miracle. He tucked them away, then turned to the metal drawers. Surgical gloves, torn packaging but intact, a small stash of gauze, a half-used roll of medical tape. And then, jackpot, 2 cans of powdered formula, tucked in the corner behind expired antibiotics. He crouched, nearly laughing in relief. One of the cans was punctured. He discarded it. The other he handled like porcelain, wrapping it in fabric, placing it gently into his satchel. He moved fast after that, scanning each room with efficient eyes. The last thing he needed was to draw attention. He didn't know who else might be out here. On his way back through the corridor, he paused at a familiar doorway. Dr. Halim's office. He hadn't been in here since the bombing. The room was dusty, the bookshelves partially collapsed. Medical texts lay in broken heaps. A photograph on the floor, Halim smiling, arm around a boy who looked like his son, both in white coats. Ammar hesitated, then crossed the room and set the photo upright on the desk. For a moment, he stood there, just breathing, just remembering. Then he turned to leave. That's when he heard it, a low rustle. Footsteps? He froze, reached instinctively for the small blade tucked in his belt, not for violence, but deterrence. Silence. Then a voice, software shaky. "Doctor?" He turned slowly. A girl, maybe 16, stood near the broken door. Thin, wrapped in a shawl too small for the cold. She carried something, a plastic bag with torn handles cradled to her chest. Her eyes met his, fear and hope warring in her expression. I heard there's a doctor who didn't leave." He didn't answer, just nodded, his gaze falling to the bundle she carried. A newborn, swaddled poorly, lips pale. "How long?" he asked. "Since last night. She won't eat. She's cold." He gestured. "Come." They walked in silence, cutting back through alleys, Ammar checking behind them every few steps. She said her name was Salma. Her family was gone. The baby's name was Huda. As they reached the hospital gate, she slowed. Will you let me stay?" Ammar opened the door wide. "There's always room," he said. Inside, the hospital welcomed them like a silent witness. He guided Salma to the upper room, where warmth lingered and breath still stirred in the blankets. She looked around, her eyes wide with disbelief. "They're all..." "Yes," he said softly. "All left behind. But not alone." He took Huda in his arms, hands moving by instinct, checked her vitals. She was small, dangerously cold, but alive. He handed Salma a warm cloth, showed her how to wrap the infant tighter. She watched closely, her hands trembling. "Can I help?" she asked. Ammar looked at her then, not with pity, but with recognition. He remembered being her age, on his first hospital shift, unsure, eager, standing at the edge of something larger than himself. "Yes," he said simply. "You can." He showed her where the water was stored, how to warm it gently over the burner, how to sterilize cloth, how to whisper when entering the room, to keep the babies calm. She followed every instruction like scripture. Later, he found her sitting beside Amal, humming something under her breath, a song he didn't know. Amal stirred, then stilled again, soothed. That night, he gave Salma one of the old cots near the supply room. She lay there quietly, arms wrapped around her daughter. Before he left her for the night, she looked up. "Why did you stay, doctor?" He paused, one hand on the doorway. Because every child saved," he said, "carries a piece of what this place was, and what it could be again." She nodded slowly, and for the first time since arriving, her shoulders eased. In the hallway, Ammar stood alone again, but the hospital didn't feel quite so hollow. The silence had shifted. It wasn't empty anymore. It was waiting. In the weeks that followed, the hospital began to change, not in structure, but in spirit. There was still rubble in the stairwell. The generator coughed on cold mornings. Rain seeped through the old maternity roof, and the babies still cried at night. But in subtle ways, a rhythm was forming again. A rhythm Ammar hadn't felt in a long time. Salma became part of it. Each morning, she rose before dawn to heat water, wash cloths, and check on Huda. She was gentle but quick, quiet but precise. Ammar rarely had to explain something twice. She learned the way a plant leans toward light, naturally, steadily. Together, they managed what had once required a dozen hands. She fed Yasmin while Ammar prepped Layla's IV. He sterilized gauze while she comforted Noura through a coughing fit. They worked mostly in silence, occasionally exchanging a look or a single word. Warmth, watch, good. In those silences, something unexpected began to return. Not ease, but trust. One evening, as dusk filtered through the broken window panes, Salma sat by Amal's cot, humming again. That same quiet tune she'd sung on her first night. Ammar listened from the hallway. He recognized it now. A lullaby from Aleppo. His mother had sung it too. After the babies slept, they shared tea over a small burner flame. The leaves were old, bitter, all that remained in the stores. But the warmth made it something more. Salma spoke, unprompted. I wanted to be a midwife. Before. Ammar looked up. Before the war? She nodded. I used to watch the nurse in our village. The way she held women's hands, talked them through pain. It was like she pulled life through their bodies with her voice alone. He stirred the tea slowly. That's a gift. Salma shrugged. It was a dream. No, he said. It still is. She didn't reply, but her eyes shone differently after that. One morning, they woke to the sound of distant helicopters, not the heavy thump of gunships. Something lighter, faster. Drones. Ammar moved quickly, drawing blackout cloth over the nursery windows. Salma helped without a word. The babies stirred, sensing the shift in air. A whine overhead, then silence. He listened, holding his breath. No strike followed, just that oppressive quiet. After a while, Salma looked at him. You think they saw us? Maybe, maybe not. She glanced at the ceiling. Does it change anything? No, he said. We stay alert, that's all. But that day, he doubled the emergency drills, reviewed the escape routes, such as they were, reinforced the basement hatch with a metal rod from the old surgical table. Salma watched carefully, her movements growing more deliberate. Later, when the air settled, they resumed their rounds. Yasmin's fever had broken. Noura's cough softened. Huda gained 100 grams. Ammar made a note of it in the journal. Then he added something new. S assisted with treatment plan. Hands steady, heart focused. He hadn't told her he was keeping notes about her too. Not yet. That night, Salma found him on the roof, what was left of it, looking up at the stars. He heard her steps, but didn't turn. I used to think, she said, that stars were souls watching us from the other side. He finally looked at her. And now? I still think that, but not all of them are gone. Some are still walking with us. The wind shifted. The babies cried below. Ammar smiled faintly. Come, he said. They'll need you soon. And they went together, down into the flickering warmth, where life pressed on in the quietest, most stubborn ways. Salma by his side, and the stars, above, bearing witness. Winter arrived quietly that year, not with sudden storms, but with a slow tightening of cold around the bones of the hospital. The nights grew longer, candles burned faster, breath lingered in the air like fog. Inside the nursery, the babies were wrapped in every scrap of warmth Ammar and Salma could find. Layers of wool, swaddled cloth, even shredded old coats. They rotated the warmers between cribs every 2 hours. It wasn't ideal, but it kept the smallest hearts beating. They took turns sleeping. If Ammar nodded off during the third watch, Salma gently took over without waking him. If she slipped into a nap near dawn, he adjusted the warmer before she stirred. The old metal stove, salvaged from the basement, became their sun. Ammar fed it with wood from broken furniture, even a few textbooks he'd once sworn never to part with. Desperate heat took what sentiment couldn't. On the worst nights, the wind howled like a voice, a long, aching sound that made the windows tremble. Salma said it reminded her of the sea. Ammar said it reminded him of the night the walls first cracked, but neither let fear settle long. They had work to do. One evening, as snow whispered against the outer wall, Amal began to seize. It started with a twitch in her arm, then a full-body shudder. Her limbs jerked uncontrollably, eyes rolling back. Salma cried out, "Doctor!" Ammar was already moving. He scooped Amal into his arms, felt her temperature, burning. "Septic," he said under his breath. "Too fast." He barked orders, short, clipped. "Gloves, clamp, fourth line, now." Salma didn't hesitate. She brought supplies with trembling hands, holding them open like offerings. Ammar worked quickly, fingers finding the tiny vein, sliding the needle with practiced urgency. He connected the fluids, adjusted the flow, stabilized her head with a folded cloth. Her body arched once more, then stilled. The seconds stretched like wire. Then a breath. Shallow, but there. Ammar exhaled. Salma was crying softly, her face streaked with soot from the stove. "She'll live," Ammar said gently. "How do you know?" "Because she's still fighting, and we're still here." They didn't sleep that night. Amal's breathing remained shallow for hours. Ammar stayed beside her, monitoring vitals, adjusting her position every 20 minutes. Salma fed Huda and soothed Layla, humming her lullaby again, low and steady. By dawn, Amal's fever broke. When the first thin light hit the floor, she blinked. Ammar leaned in. "Hello again," he whispered. Salma sat down hard on the floor, head in her hands, overwhelmed with quiet relief. They didn't celebrate. There wasn't time or food or energy for it, but they shared a glance, deep and warm, that said everything. They kept moving. Later that week, Ammar found a rusted canister buried under rubble in the old kitchen. Fuel, enough for 2 full burns in the stove. He rationed it like gold. That night, for the first time in months, they sat by a real flame. Ammar brewed tea again, not bitter this time, but warm, fragrant, sweetened by a single cube of sugar Salma had tucked away since her arrival. They drank in silence. Then Salma spoke. Do you ever think of leaving?" Ammar looked into the fire. "Every day." She didn't flinch. "But I stay because..." He paused. "Because the ones who left gave me something to carry. Their work, their hopes, their voices. This place is not just brick, it's memory. And these children, they're more than lives. They're our legacy." Salma nodded. "Then I'll stay too." Ammar didn't reply, but in that moment he knew she meant it. Outside, snow fell, quiet, relentless. Inside, 6 hearts beat against the cold, and 2 more stood guard, not just surviving, but choosing. Choosing to stay, to believe, to rebuild, not someday, but now, with every breath, every wrapped cloth, every whispered word of comfort in the middle of a freezing night. There were days when time didn't feel like time at all, more like a thick fog they moved through, marked only by feedings, fevers, or the sound of distant shelling. It was during one of those muted days that a new sound came to the hospital gates. A knock. Not a blast, not a scrape. A deliberate human knock. Ammar paused mid-step, listening. Salma froze where she stood, cloth in hand, eyes darting toward the door. Another knock, then a voice. "Doctor?" Is there a doctor here? Male, calm, desperate but composed. Ammar descended carefully, hand on the stair rail, and opened the heavy door by a few inches. Outside stood a man, thin, mid-40s, wrapped in a long coat dusted with ash. He held something bundled in a woven blanket. Behind him, an old van idled, its tires half submerged in rubble. "I heard," the man began, his voice hoarse. "I heard there's a doctor who stayed. My name's Karim. My wife. She gave birth in the van. She's bleeding. The baby's cold. Please." Ammar opened the door wider. "Bring them," Karim called out softly. From the van, a younger woman emerged slowly, leaning on the doorframe, her steps wavering. In her arms, an infant, unmoving. Salma was already running down the stairs with a stretcher board, motioning urgently. Together, they eased the woman inside. Ammar checked her pulse, weak but steady. The baby was another story. He took the child from her arms, blue lips, no cry, limpio. He didn't speak. He simply moved, to the table, to the lamp, to the small kit they'd prepared for just this. He cleared the airway, began compressions with 2 fingers, rhythm steady. Salma warmed a cloth by the stove, rushing it over. Karim stood frozen near the door, eyes wide, lips moving in silent prayer. 30 seconds, a minute, then a cough, so soft it could have been imagined, then a breath, then another. The baby began to cry, faint, but there. Ammar exhaled. "She's breathing," he said. The woman, still on the stretcher, began to sob. Karim sank to his knees. Later, after they were settled, mother resting, baby swaddled beside her, Ammar sat with Karim in the hall. "I thought the hospital was gone," Karim said. "Everyone said it had been shelled, abandoned." "It was," Ammar replied. "But it still stands." Karim's eyes flickered. "There are more families, hiding, with newborns, sick children. They don't come because they think nothing's left." "Tell them it's not true," Ammar said. Karim leaned forward, voice low. "Will you accept them? More? As long as we breathe," Ammar said quietly. "We'll take them." That night, Salma and Ammar prepared 2 more beds. They doubled formula rations. Ammar adjusted dosage plans. Salma moved between rooms with steady urgency, wrapping limbs, refilling warmers, checking vitals. The hospital was growing again. Not in space, that remained broken, scorched, but in purpose, in presence. In the days that followed, word spread. A woman arrived carrying her grandson, a boy, no older than 10, pulled a wagon with a bandaged toddler inside. A midwife, graying and quiet, knocked one morning and said simply, "I can help." Each arrival brought its own sorrow, its own weight, but it also brought light. The hospital no longer felt like a tomb. It felt like a promise. One made again and again, every time someone knocked and Ammar opened the door. Every time a child's breath was coaxed back from the edge. Every time the stove glowed warm in the corner of a cold, crumbling world. Every time Salma whispered that lullaby. They had no banner, no signpost, only an open door, and that was enough. By the turn of the month, the hospital had become something else. Not just a place of recovery, but a kind of quiet sanctuary. People no longer arrived only in crisis. They came seeking warmth, rest, and the steadiness of Ammar's hands, of Salma's voice, of the baby's steady breathing. Word traveled through neighborhoods, whispered between alleyways, and shared beneath tarps. They didn't call it a hospital anymore. They called it Bait al-Amal, the House of Hope. The name came from a boy named Ziad. He was 8. Carried his younger sister across 2 districts, her leg broken from a fallen wall. When they arrived, Ammar asked him how he'd found the place. Ziad simply said, "I followed the stories." After Ammar set the girl's bone and wrapped it tight, Ziad whispered something to Salma. That night, Salma wrote it in charcoal on a piece of plywood and nailed it to the entryway. Bait al-Amal. Ammar saw it the next morning. He said nothing, but he touched the letters gently before stepping inside. More volunteers arrived, people with no formal training, just capable hands and kind hearts. Salma took the lead, showing them how to rotate warmers, how to clean equipment, how to comfort a frightened child without saying a word. Ammar focused on the medical tasks, infection control, nutrition, oxygen levels. But he noticed something had shifted. He no longer had to do it all alone. One afternoon, he walked past a room and saw a boy, barely 15, reading an old anatomy book to a group of smaller children, pointing to the drawings like they were bedtime stories. Ammar paused, smiled. The hospital was learning how to breathe again, but it wasn't without cost. Rations were dwindling. Medicine supplies were down to single digits in key vials. Saline, formula, antibiotics, all nearly gone. Ammar inventoried every bottle, every gauze, every gram of powdered milk. He made a new chart, did the math again and again. He didn't share the numbers with anyone. Instead, he started waking earlier, foraging farther, scavenging at dawn through what remained of the old clinic 3 blocks west. He moved fast, quiet, often alone. One morning he returned with a fractured crate of formula tins, most expired, but one still usable. That day, Yasmin gained her first healthy gram in 3 weeks. Every bit mattered. Salma began bartering quietly, a pair of wool gloves for a bundle of gauze, her old earrings for a clean flask of kerosene. They gave everything away and asked for nothing in return. Still, Ammar feared the weight was growing. One night, he woke in the hallway, slumped against the wall. He didn't remember falling asleep. Salma found him there, a blanket draped around his shoulders. She sat beside him, offering a spoonful of broth she'd saved from dinner. He shook his head. "It's fine. You need rest. I need supplies." She looked at him for a long moment. Then, "What if we asked for help?" He turned. "From who?" "There's a radio in the basement," she said. "I've seen it. Maybe it still works." Ammar hesitated. Radios brought danger. Signals drew attention. Attention invited bombs. But his silence was answer enough. That night, he descended into the dark of the basement. The radio was there, half buried in dust and cloth. Old, analog, antennae bent but intact. He cleaned it gently, checked the wires, connected it to the backup battery. It hissed, then popped, then static, a flicker of hope. He adjusted the dial. Voices, broken, foreign, drifting. He wrote down what he heard. 2 hours later, he found a frequency in Arabic. Humanitarian corridor, time, coordinates, 1 day only. Ammar sat very still, then climbed the stairs to find Salma. The broadcast repeated twice during the night. Same words, same coordinates. A humanitarian convoy would pass through a corridor to the north, just beyond the old textile district. A one-time delivery, medicine, food, and fuel. Ammar circled the location on a hand-drawn map. It wasn't far, 6 kilometers, but every street between here and there had teeth, checkpoints, snipers, and the kind of silence that meant someone was always watching. Still, it was a chance. The next morning, before the sun crested the rooftops, Ammar and Salma stood in the hallway looking at the map. "If you go, I'll stay," Salma said. I wasn't going to ask. She smiled faintly. I know. He packed light. A sled made from a salvage door, a makeshift harness, a signal flag in white paint. Salma prepared a letter of need, signed with the name of the hospital, though there was no one left to recognize it. Before he left, he checked every room. Amal was feeding well. Huda had a clean bandage. Kareem's wife was sitting up now, her baby blinking slowly against her chest. Ammar knelt by Ziad. "You're in charge of the front gate," he said. "No one gets in unless Salma says so." Ziad stood straighter. "Yes, doctor." Then Ammar looked at Salma. There were no words to cover it all, so he used none, just a nod, and he was gone. The streets were still frost-bitten from the night. He moved fast, hugging walls, ducking through broken doors, the sled gliding behind him with a whisper. The textile district smelled like dust and scorched fiber. But in the clearing where the convoy was supposed to arrive, they were there. Trucks, aid workers, soldiers in blue helmets. He raised both hands, walked forward slowly. They waved him in. Inside the main supply truck, he explained, quietly, clearly, the babies, the mothers, the infections and fever, and how they'd survived all these months alone. One worker listened, another took notes. Then the supervisor stepped forward. He looked at Ammar's ID, at the folded hospital document, then at Ammar. "You're the one who stayed," he said. Ammar didn't answer. "We heard rumors," the man continued. "Didn't think anyone was still alive inside that building." "There are 14, Ammar said. "All alive. Barely. We need supplies, formula, antibiotics, anything." The man signaled his team. Boxes were loaded onto the sled, more than Ammar could have imagined. Vials, sealed tins, medical-grade warmers, a new oxygen tank. Fuel, more than he'd hoped for, but less than they needed. Still, it was a beginning. The man offered transport. Ammar refused. "Too loud, too big. I'll get it there." They shook hands. By dusk, Ammar was halfway back, hauling the sled through a narrow alley when a bullet cracked the sky overhead. He dropped flat, pulling the sled behind a collapsed cart. Another shot, farther off, less direct. Sniper fire. He waited, breath still. Then, slowly, inch by inch, he moved. By the time he reached the outer wall of the hospital, his arms were shaking, sweat freezing against his skin. Ziad opened the door before he knocked. "You came back," the boy said. Ammar smiled just once. "I said I would." Inside, Salma saw the supplies and covered her mouth. That night, for the first time in weeks, they had sterile gloves, clean syringes, an unbroken case of pediatric antibiotics. Ammar distributed them like blessings. And when the lights flickered back on, powered by the donated fuel, a soft cheer rose from the hallway. Not loud, not triumphant, just grateful. Salma stood at the nursery window, watching the shadows of snowfall blur against the warm light inside. "It's enough," she whispered. And Ammar, from behind her, said, "For now." They didn't say the war was over. They didn't pretend the worst wouldn't come again. But for one night, one still, glowing night, the hospital felt not like a place that had refused to die, but a place reborn. The House of Hope had a heartbeat. And Ammar slept for 4 hours, uninterrupted, for the first time in months. The next morning brought soft light through shattered panes, dust motes hanging like slow confetti over sleeping cots. Ammar woke to the smell of lentils and cumin. Someone was cooking again. The makeshift kitchen had become the heart of the building. One of the new volunteers, an older man named Samir, had taken over meals with the care of a grandfather. measuring each portion as if it were a ritual. It reminded Ammar of before, not of war, not of blood, but of family. Salma handed him a cup of warm tea. "You slept," she said. He sipped. "I did." There was something about the way she looked at him, not like a colleague or even a friend, but someone who'd walked through fire with you and come out with matching scars. Over the next few days, they stabilized more patients. The formula held. Infections retreated. Mothers smiled again. Ammar adjusted his schedule, finally giving in to sleep for 2 hours each afternoon. Salma took the night watches more often. Each evening, the sound of children could be heard through the hall. Laughter, quiet games with string, the lullabies Salma hummed as she mended torn blankets by the stove. But survival bred new questions. What came next? They couldn't live on ration boxes and luck forever. They needed something sustainable, something that wouldn't vanish the next time the corridor closed. It was Zayed who had the first idea. "Why don't we trade?" he asked one afternoon, sitting on the stairs with Salma. "You know, like offer help, then ask for help." Salma tilted her head. "What do you mean?" "People out there. They've got chickens, soap, sometimes batteries, but they don't know we're alive. We should send letters." Letters. It was innocent, almost quaint. But Ammar listened. He drafted short messages. Pediatric care available at Beit al-Amal, no cost. Assistance welcomed. Then gave Ziad the task of delivery, sliding notes under doorways, pinning them to fences. Always discreet, always quiet. Within 3 days, the first reply came. A bag of rice wrapped in cloth. No name, just the note. For the children. Then came a chicken, then some soap, then clean sheets. It worked. The hospital was beginning to knit itself into the remnants of the city, thread by thread. One evening, Salma entered Ammar's room holding a jar of honey. "This came today," she said, with a note that said, "Your kindness is remembered." Ammar stared at it. Honey. The kind his father used to spoon into tea when he was a boy. "I never thought I'd see this again," he whispered. She placed the jar beside his bed. "It's not medicine, but I think we needed it." He nodded. There were still sirens in the distance, still the echo of war like a tired drumbeat. But the inside of the hospital was changing. Walls were cleaner, the floors swept. Children drew pictures on the plaster with bits of charcoal. One drawing stood out, a small child's version of the hospital, but glowing like a lantern under a night sky. People gathered inside, smiling. Salma found Ammar staring at it later, his fingers resting gently on the edge of the wall. "That's what they see now," she said softly. He looked down. "We have to keep earning it." She didn't disagree. That night, the power flickered again, just once before steadying. Outside, a cold wind howled across the debris. But inside, someone was singing softly in Arabic, a tune that carried through the halls like a lullaby sown from light. And for a moment, just a moment, it felt like the walls themselves were listening. Winter dug in its heels, and the city slowed beneath the frost. The cold became a quiet enemy, not loud like bombs, not sharp like bullets, but creeping and constant. Pipes froze. Breath lingered in the air. Babies shivered in their blankets no matter how tightly they were wrapped. Ammar moved through the nursery like a shadow, checking toes, fingers, the hue of lips. Cold could steal life without warning. He kept the warmers running day and night, rotating the fuel supply like a miser guarding gold. But even warmth has its limits. The power flickered more often now. The donated generator sputtered. Ammar and Salma took turns cranking the backup manually. A long, aching process, but one they endured because the babies needed it. One night, just past midnight, the generator failed entirely. No lights, no hum, no warmth. The silence felt too deep, like the hospital had stopped breathing. Salma lit a candle. Its flame flickered over the pale faces of the infants, their tiny chests rising, falling, like paper caught in slow wind. Ammar stared at the generator. He had tried everything. Fuel line, coils, intake. It was finished. They pulled blankets tighter, gathered the babies into a single room, where they huddled them close together for warmth. Salma took one in each arm. Ammar wrapped himself around the smallest of the twins. "Body heat will have to be enough," he said. No one slept. At dawn, a boy from the next district arrived with a letter. In it was a drawing, a diagram of a wind turbine, and a note. "I can help." His name was Mahmoud, 17, a former engineering student. He'd seen Ziad's notes. He had an idea. They gave him the roof. Mahmoud worked from sunup to sunset. He scavenged metal poles, stripped wiring, repurposed bicycle parts into gears. He enlisted other kids to help, offering them lessons in exchange for hands. Salma called them the rooftop apprentices. Ammar watched from below, quiet, skeptical, but not interfering. 5 days later, the turbine spun for the first time, slowly, then faster, then steady. The lights flickered on. A cheer rose through the building, tired but real. Mahmoud grinned. "It won't power the whole thing," he said, "but it can run the nursery." Ammar put a hand on his shoulder. "That's everything." The hospital breathed again, and Mahmoud stayed. They gave him a cot in the old records room, which he converted into a tiny workshop. He said it felt good to use his mind again, to build. One night, he told Ammar, "You saved lives. Let me help save their future." The hospital's rhythms adjusted. Ammar no longer walked the halls alone. Salma took charge of the new hygiene clinic they set up on the second floor. Mahmoud taught classes in basic electricity to kids too young to remember what school was. Even Ziad got promoted. "Assistant coordinator," he announced proudly. His clipboard was a slab of drywall, his pen tied to a string. Ammar began to hope, not in loud ways, not in big dreams, but in tiny, stubborn ones, like more days with light, like a world where Salma smiled more often than she wept, like children growing up knowing who they were, not just what they'd survived. The hospital had endured siege, hunger, darkness. Now it had something else, momentum. And that, Ammar thought, might be the rarest miracle of all. When spring finally cracked the shell of winter, it did so gently. Shoots of green slipped between rubble. Vines curled along broken windows. Birds returned, thin, uncertain, but present. Their songs stitched new music into the mornings. Inside Bait al-Amal, the mood shifted. Not dramatically, but there was lift. Lighter laughter, fuller meals, longer sleeps. The babies were growing. Amal had her first tooth. Youssef rolled over on his own. The twins now responded to their names, Rami and Rana, heads turning in unison like flowers following the sun. Ammar watched them with quiet awe. He knew the statistics, knew what survival meant, medically, biologically, probabilistically. But this, watching them live, wasn't data. It was something deeper. It was witnessing. Still, the war had not ended. Gunfire echoed on certain nights. Entire neighborhoods remained hollow, but the hospital's outreach effort continued. Salma and Ziad now ran mobile visits, walking to nearby buildings, tending to elders, checking pregnant women too frail to travel. They carried with them a bag of supplies and a thick ledger. "We're not just a hospital anymore," Salma said one evening. "We're becoming a system." Mahmoud, meanwhile, had built a second turbine. This one powered a pump, bringing clean water up from the old municipal line. It changed everything. No more rationing buckets, no more boiling runoff. The new water station became a meeting place. People brought jugs. They stayed for conversation. Hope was becoming habit. Still, Ammar kept his guard. He counted rations daily, monitored medicine stocks with sharp eyes, studied each child's chart like scripture. "Someday," Salma said to him, "you're going to have to let them live without fearing they'll die." He didn't respond, because he wasn't sure he knew how. One evening, a stranger arrived, an older man in a tattered coat holding a box. Inside, photographs, faded, water-damaged, but unmistakable. He used to be a photographer, he said. His studio had been bombed, but he'd kept these, and he wanted to give them to Beit al-Amal, so the children know what before looked like. Salma hung the photos on the hallway walls, families smiling on park benches, a woman sipping tea beside a cat, a boy holding a balloon on a cobbled street. People stopped to look. It wasn't nostalgia, it was history, proof that life had once been ordinary here, and might be again. Mahmoud added a corkboard below the photos. "For what comes next," he said. Children started adding drawings, notes, names of family members they remembered. Zayed wrote, "When I grow up, I want to be kind." Ammar stood before that note for a long time. Later that night, he walked to the nursery, sat beside the window, and listened to the wind carry birdsong into the sleeping room. Salma joined him in silence. Then she whispered, "Do you think they'll remember us?" He looked down at the babies, curled and peaceful. "They'll remember warmth," he said, "and safety, and hands that held them." She nodded. "That's enough." Outside, the wind shifted. The vines trembled. Somewhere in the dark, a night flower opened, and inside, the house of hope kept breathing. On the hospital rooftop, Mahmoud was adjusting the angle of the newest turbine when he noticed the figure. A girl, barely 12, standing alone at the edge of the courtyard below. She was holding a blanket-wrapped bundle, not moving, just waiting. He called down to Ziad, who sprinted across the yard and spoke with her quietly before waving to Ammar. They brought her inside. Her name was Lena. She hadn't spoken in 2 days. Her parents had been killed during a raid on a shelter in the Western Quarter. Neighbors told her to run east. She'd heard whispers of the hospital that still took children. She had walked nearly 8 kilometers with her baby brother in her arms. Salma helped unwrap the child, no more than a month old, underweight, silent. His name was Sammy. Ammar checked his pulse. Slow, but steady. The girl still wouldn't speak. She held onto the hem of her shirt, eyes locked on her brother's face. "We'll help him," Salma said gently. "You did the right thing bringing him here." Ammar met her gaze. "She kept him alive in this cold. That's already a miracle." They admitted, both of them. Salma gave Lena her own cot. Mahmoud rigged a small lamp so she wouldn't be afraid at night. Ziad made her a journal with blank pages and a pencil stub. "In case you feel like writing," he said. The next morning, she drew. A picture of a long road, a child with a bundle, and a warm light in the distance. The hospital. She didn't need to say anything else. Sami stabilized within days. Lena stayed beside him, feeding, changing, humming lullabies that sounded more like memories than melodies. And slowly, the girl began to return. One evening, she joined the others in the meal line. Later, she asked if she could help fold bandages. Salma kissed the top of her head. "You're already helping." Ammar added her name to the residency chart. They were running out of space. The patient records, once barely a page, now filled a binder. Salma color-coded the entries. Red for critical, blue for stable, green for discharge ready. Ammar noticed something one night as he turned the pages. The green tabs were growing. People weren't just surviving anymore. They were healing, leaving, moving on. It stirred something uncertain in him. Pride, yes, but also fear. He found Salma in the hallway. "What happens if they all leave?" he asked. She looked at him, surprised. "Isn't that the point?" He nodded, but his eyes stayed distant. It had become more than survival, more than medicine. This place, Bait al-Amal, had become a part of them. Salma stepped closer. "We're not losing them. We're sending them forward. That's what hope does." He exhaled. "I just don't know what to do when the rooms are quiet." She smiled softly. "Then maybe it'll be your turn to rest." In the days that followed, Lena began asking questions about fevers, about dosage, about reading heartbeats. Salma said, "She's watching you, like Ziad watches Mahmoud." Ammar looked at the little girl with the steady eyes and whispered songs. "Maybe she's the one who'll take over," he said. "Maybe," Salma replied. "Maybe they all will." Outside, the wind began to warm. Buds bloomed along a half-collapsed vine. Inside, the hospital didn't feel like a refuge anymore. It felt like a beginning. The message came just after dusk. A folded scrap of paper, hand-delivered by a boy who vanished as quickly as he arrived. It read, "Evacuation corridor open. 3 days only. No signature, no details. Just that. A lifeline with an expiration date." Salma read it 3 times before handing it to Ammar. They stood in the dim hallway, fluorescent lights casting soft halos on the concrete floor. Outside, birds had returned to the crumbling trees. Inside, it felt like the wind had stopped moving. Salma spoke first. "We have to tell them." Ammar nodded, but slowly. His eyes were far away. That night, they gathered everyone in the wide hall near the kitchen. Patients, volunteers, children, elders. Mahmoud leaned against a wall. Lena sat quietly, holding Sami. Ziad balanced on the edge of a chair, his eyes unusually serious. Salma stepped forward. "There's an opportunity to leave the city," she said. "We don't know how long it will last, but it may be the last safe passage for a long time." Silence followed her words, thick and reverent. Ammar stood beside her, hands folded. "We built this place so you could heal," he said. "If you choose to leave, we will help you. We'll organize everything, transport, supplies. If you choose to stay, we'll keep doing what we've always done." He looked around the room, at the faces who had come broken and stayed to rebuild. "You don't owe anyone your bravery, but you have earned your choice." One by one, the conversations began. Some knew immediately. Mothers clutching children. An old man with failing eyesight who'd once been a poet. A boy who hadn't spoken since losing his sister, now whispering, "I want to see what's beyond the walls." Others were hesitant. Lena refused at first. "This is our home now," she said. Salma knelt beside her. "It is, and you're brave, but you don't have to carry the world forever." Mahmoud surprised everyone. "I'm going," he said. "There's a program in Jordan, engineering. I want to learn more. Bring it back someday." Ammar clapped a hand on his shoulder. "You already built light in the dark. I can't imagine what you'll build with peace." Over the next 2 days, the hospital became a flurry of movement. Packs were stitched from old sheets, carts fixed for wheelchairs, rations portioned with care. Everyone had a role, even Ziad, who kept a handwritten manifest of names and routes. Ammar helped load the first truck. He lifted Amal into the arms of her mother, kissed the boy who once arrived in silence, now laughing in the sun, watched as Mahmoud hugged Salma, leaving behind a notebook full of diagrams. Lena stood near the gate, holding Sami, eyes rimmed with tears. Salma approached gently. "You can still go." Lena shook her head. "I belong here." Salma didn't argue. When the last truck pulled away, it kicked up dust that lingered like memory. The hospital was quieter. Fewer footsteps, fewer cots filled, but not empty, not hollow. Ammar stood in the nursery, listening to the soft rhythm of breath from the babies who remained. Salma entered behind him. "They'll reach safety," she said. He nodded. "And we'll be here," he added, "for whoever comes next." Outside, the vines had begun blooming. Inside, the hallway walls bore drawings of goodbye. Little hands waving, hearts, suns, names in bright colors. Beit al-Amal was still standing. But more than that, it was still alive. The silence after the exodus was unfamiliar. Not empty, just different. The corridors, once bustling with the chaos of survival, were now calm. The kitchen echoed with the sound of a single spoon in a pot. The nursery, once filled with overlapping cries and coos, now held a handful of babies and a deeper kind of stillness. Ammar moved through these spaces like a man between chapters. He checked vitals, monitored weights, adjusted doses, but his steps had slowed. Not from fatigue, from reflection. He wasn't just doctoring anymore. He was remembering names, faces, first cries, final goodbyes. He held them all inside like photographs in a box, too fragile to reopen. Lena was still there. She helped now, not just out of duty, but with intention. She learned to clean instruments, to recognize fever signs, to swaddle with practiced hands. She rarely spoke, but when she did, her voice carried. "I want to stay," she told him one morning as they watched dawn spill into the nursery. "I know," he replied. Salma continued her rounds, quieter too, but steady. Her presence remained the spine of the hospital. She kept records with precision, managed the remaining supplies, comforted the newcomers, because they still came, trickling in. A woman fleeing alone, a wounded man carried by strangers, a child with an injury too old for emergency care, but too fresh to be ignored. Beit al-Amal adapted. Each room once emptied by departure became a station. One for postnatal rehab, one for trauma counseling, another for storing and distributing the limited medicine they still received from outside networks. Zayed remained as well, now taller, more confident. He drew up the charts, ran messages, called roll each morning like a teacher in a classroom without walls. "We're a team," he'd say, as if daring the world to challenge that. Then, one evening, a low rumble stirred the ground. Not bombs, not warplanes. Thunder. It was the first true rain in months, and it fell not in torrents, but in slow, patient drops, soaking the roof, the vines, the dry earth. Ammar stepped outside and stood in it. No coat, no umbrella. Just his face turned upward like a question being answered. Salma joined him. No words passed between them, but she held out her hand, catching a droplet like a memory. In the days that followed, rain became a blessing and a burden. Leaks revealed themselves in old seams. Buckets appeared in corridors, but no one complained. The vines grew thicker. The roof garden, Mahmoud's final project before leaving, blossomed with tiny greens, enough for herbs, tea. Bitterness turned into flavor. Children began drawing in chalk along the walls again. Not goodbye notes this time, but scenes. Sunrises, birds, people holding hands. Beit al-Amal had shifted once more, from refuge to community to something else entirely, a symbol. One morning, a man arrived with a camera. Not a weapon, not a plea, just a camera. He asked to document what was being done here. Salma hesitated. Ammar studied him. Finally, Ammar nodded. "Tell it gently," he said. The man stayed a week. He photographed the nursery, the garden, the solar rig Mahmoud had built. He recorded Ziad calling roll, Lena folding gauze, Ammar whispering to a newborn as he checked her lungs. When he left, he said only, "The world needs to remember this." And maybe, Ammar thought, they finally would. The next evening, as he walked the halls, he saw something taped to the wall outside the nursery. It was one of the photographer's photos, printed small, in black and white. Lena had added a note beside it, in tidy, deliberate handwriting. It read, "We are still here." And Ammar paused, because it was true. They were, still healing, still hoping, still here. In the deep hours of night, when even the wind had softened, Ammar sat alone in the nursery. The monitors blinked faintly. The children breathed in gentle rhythm, a chorus of tiny inhales and peaceful murmurs. This, he thought, was what peace must sound like. Not silence, but safety. Salma found him there, seated beside the window, a sleeping infant resting on his chest. She didn't say anything at first, just sat beside him. They watched the night pass like a quiet stream. "I had a dream," Ammar whispered, "that the building was gone, but the sound of the children remained, like an echo that never ended." Salma rested her head against the wall. "Maybe that's what you've built," she said. "Something that won't stop, even if we do." There were fewer patients now, not because the need had vanished, but because the seed had been planted. What Beit al-Amal did, others were beginning to do too. Ziad had started teaching neighborhood teens basic first aid. Lena kept a small journal of cases, carefully copied from Ammar's notes. "So no one has to start from zero," she said. And Ammar, the man who once refused to evacuate, who bore each child's weight like a vow, had started something he never thought he would. He began to write. In the quiet moments after rounds, when the beds were settled and the hallways still, he took up a pen and recorded the stories, not just the medical charts, but the laughter in the hallway, the first words, the first steps. The night they danced after Amal spoke her first word, Nur, which meant light. Ammar called the journal Beit al-Amal, Book of Life. Salma added to it too. Ziad drew pictures in the margins. Lena added dates. Even the elders wrote brief memories, one-liners, poems, fragments of who they had been. It became a living archive. One morning, a woman from an international relief group arrived, escorted by local health workers. She stood in awe at the building wrapped in vines, full of drawings and scent of tea. She met the team, saw the systems, touched the warmth that couldn't be measured. She asked Ammar, what would it take to make more of these? He didn't answer right away. He thought about what couldn't be packed. The ache of staying, the weight of loss, the stubbornness of love, the countless nights they whispered hope into fevered ears. Finally, he said, "You don't build these. You become them." She nodded, understanding. Later, as she left, she placed her hand over her heart. "Thank you for carrying the light." Ammar watched her walk away, The sun was rising now. Its first beams cut through the eastern window, touching the sleeping faces of the newest arrivals. Each child was another reason, another promise. Beit al-Amal, the House of Hope, had endured siege, hunger, grief, and the long, bone-deep silence of war. But through one man's refusal to leave, one doctor's quiet defiance, it had become something more. A place where life could begin again. A place where light never left. A place still here, still breathing, still carrying. In a city carved by grief and dust, a single man stood when everything around him fell. Not for glory, not for vengeance, but for life. The tiniest forms of it, wrapped in blankets and silence. Ammar never asked to be a hero. He asked only that children be held, that breath be given space, that hope, even bruised and trembling, be given room to live. In Beit al-Amal, he found more than duty. He found a quiet revolution. Through every newborn cry that broke the silence of siege, through every small hand clutching his finger, he stitched humanity back into the torn fabric of war. And in doing so, he taught others to do the same. Salma, who carried peace into every room. Mahmoud, who turned scrap into salvation. Lena, who bore her grief with grace and chose to stay. Ziad, whose voice now steadied others. They did not stop the war, but they stopped its silence. They answered it with lullabies, charts, chalk drawings, and the fierce determination to remain kind. The hospital still stands, not untouched, not unchanged, but radiant with the stubborn pulse of people who would not let go. Ammar stayed. He saved lives. But perhaps more than that, he bore witness. And because he stayed, so did the light. So did the hope. So did the chance for the next child to live without fear. This is what courage looks like. Not a roar, but a whisper that keeps saying, "Stay alive."